On Chanukah, we light the candles commemorating a victory that happened thousands of years ago. We say the words, "You fought their battle, you judged their judgments, you took their revenge, you put the mighty in the hands of the weak, the many in the hands of the few." And the concept of Chanukah, and certainly lighting the menorah, is for us to remember those times. And oftentimes, when you think about that, I think we have the sense of, I don't know, thousands of years ago. How does it relate to me? How do I feel it? How do I sense that God is active and present in my world? Maybe historically back then, but do I see it today? And what relevance does the message of Chanukah have to us when we live in such a vastly different world? And I'd like to share with you something that I believe sheds tremendous light on this very issue. You see, within most of our lifetime, and if you're younger, certainly within the past 50 years, we have experienced one of the greatest miracles that has ever been brought to humanity. And a miracle that's so astonishing that if you step back with open eyes, you have to say it is inexplicable. June 1967, the small little nation of Israel was surrounded by major Arab populations, major Arab powers. There were 3 million Jews living in Israel at the time and 100 million Arabs. But besides the 5 large nations that attacked, it was the entire gathered might of the Arab nation that decided to finally put an end to this scourge, put an end to this Jewish problem. And their plan was simple, their plan was clear: drive the Jews into the sea. And it was a declaration of war, but it wasn't a declaration of war with any end other than Jewish blood, annihilation of the Jewish people. And you have to appreciate what the odds of victory for the Arabs was. 650 dunam Arab land to every 1 dunam, 1 small part Israeli land. You're talking about 5 powerful armies. We think about these Arabs as, well, I don't know, some hashish smoking, turban wearing fellows. The Egyptian legionnaires were carefully trained. Syria's air force was carefully trained. Prior to 1967, it was a very dangerous situation for Israel to shoot down an Egyptian or Syrian plane, not because of the Egyptians or the Syrians, but because almost every one of them potentially might be manned by a Soviet pilot. The USSR devoted incredible amounts of resources, money, time, and expertise in training the Egyptians, training the Syrian forces, and they were highly trained crack troops, outspending the little state of Israel by a ratio of 4-1 every year from 1948 to 1967. I was a little boy in grade school at the time. And I remember that when war was declared, when the Six-Day War began, in my school they began gathering bed sheets. The administration asked each child to go home and bring bed sheets to help the war effort. You may wonder why bed sheets? Because the Israelis, as well as the American Jews supporting, understood that there were to be so many injuries that there's no way that the Israeli hospitals could have enough bed sheets, enough linen to care for all of the wounded. And according to any normal assessment, it was to be a massacre of incredible proportions. Interestingly enough, the war was not won in 6 days. Really, it was won in 6 hours. In the very first 6 hours of the war, the entire Egyptian Air Force was destroyed, wiped out. Without air support, there was no way they could wage battle as they wanted to. But it's interesting to note, because Time magazine ran an article after the war describing the destruction of the Egyptian Air Force. Egypt and Israel are not far apart. And Egypt was well aware of the fact that Israel might just bomb their Air Force. Every Egyptian hangar which contained an Egyptian plane had a decoy hangar constructed next to it. So even if the Israelis were to bomb the hangars, they had a 1 in 2 chance of getting the hangar that actually contained the plane, whereas maybe getting the decoy. But by creating a decoy for every actual hangar housing a plane, the Egyptians knew that there was at best a 50% chance of hitting. After the war, they analyzed almost every bomb dropped on the Egyptian hangars fell on the hangars that contained the planes, and almost every decoy hangar was left untouched. And if you study the events of the war, in 6 days, not only did we win, we vanquished foes that were so mighty, so outnumbering us, so outpowering us, that it's beyond astonishing. And just as an illustration, West Point, which is the American highest academic military academy, gave its senior class a thesis project. Now, these were the seniors. These were already soldiers who had spent 4 years in school, and they were given a thesis project. And right after the Six-Day War, the professor gave the graduating class the project of planning the taking of the Golan Heights. He gave them access to all the greatest military minds, gave them access to the latest computers at the time, and as a class they were given the project, plan the taking, and plan how the best strategy to take the Golan Heights would be. After a few days, the cadets came back to the professor and said, "Sir, we can't do it." The professor said, "What do you mean?" "Based on the sheer heights of the cliff, based on the powerful Syrian armaments, and based on the weakness of the Israeli troops, there is no strategy for the taking of the Golan Heights. It cannot be done." The professor analyzed the data, agreed with the students, and gave them a different project. Yet somehow the Golan Heights were taken. A huge tract of the Sinai desert was captured, and Israel, that tiny little fledgling country, won out against armies, navies, air forces, so many times more powerful, and it did it with such astonishing speed and ease that it clearly is in the category of quite eye-opening. But just to put it into perspective, I heard about a book and I said, I must get this book. The name of the book is called The Seventh Day Soldiers Speak, and it's the chronicles of soldiers who lived through the Six-Day Wars. But after the 6th day, the 7th day, this was telling their stories, and all of the stories are written by non-religious soldiers, most of them, many of them kibbutzniks, not with any Jewish ideology. But there was one story in particular that caught my attention, and I decided that I must get this book. Here's the story. One Jeep, the driver of the Jeep, along with 4 of his other companions, are heading into the Sinai desert at the very beginning of the campaign. And he describes that as soon as they start going into the Sinai, there's a tremendous amount of sand that's being kicked up, and they lost eye contact with any of their comrades. And it wasn't until they were deep, deep into the Sinai that they realized that they were alone. 50 miles into the Sinai desert, one lone Israeli Jeep. And they understood the difficulty they were in when they saw the Egyptian MiGs flying. Now you have to appreciate, the sand of the desert is flat. Here was a Jeep of Israeli soldiers waiting to be destroyed, demolished. He describes he stopped the Jeep. He told his men, spread out. They spread out in the sand, and they knew that their end was there. And he describes that the Egyptian planes flew as low as they possibly could. And they strafed the sand. He described you could feel the sand explode. And after the first pass, when all of the planes had left, he stood up untouched. And he looked left, and he looked right, and none of his soldiers were touched either. But the Egyptians realized that they missed. So he describes that he saw them in air, turn around, and come for a second pass. Same routine, spread out. They lie down, face down in the sand, and again they feel the sand being ripped up with bullets. After the pass, he stands up, is untouched. He looks left, he looks right, and every one of the soldiers was untouched. And then he saw the Egyptians coming for a third pass because they understood that they missed and they weren't looking to miss again. Same routine, spread down in the sand. Again, the planes fly low, strafe the sand. And again, every Israeli soldier there stands up untouched. But then they understood that they were really in for trouble because the Egyptian planes circled, came back, and they were coming on a fourth pass. Now, if you're familiar with the Vietnam War, you know that napalm is a petroleum byproduct. It's a horrific, destructive force. It's effectively a bomb that ignites into fire on contact. And he describes that on the fourth pass, the Egyptian planes dropped the napalm, and he could feel the heat, the searing heat, explode. And when they passed, he stood up, and every soldier with him stood up untouched. Eventually, the Israelis came, chased them out of the sky. He survived the war, and he told his story. Now, when I originally heard about the story, I said to myself, I must read this. I must see it with my own eyes. And I went on Amazon, and I went on finding a very rare out-of-print book, but I found it, and I held it in my hands, and I read it with rapt astonishment, and exactly as I described is what he was describing. And then he comes to the punchline. Then he comes to what we learn from it. And he says these words, I guess we got lucky. And I wanted to drop the book. What? I guess we got lucky. And astonishingly, that was his conclusion. After living through a miracle that's inexplicable, after watching in front of his eyes that which can't possibly be, his lesson that he learned was, I guess we got lucky. And if you'd like to understand Jewish history, you have to do one thing. You have to step back and be objective. And you have to ask yourself, what do my eyes see? You see, if you wish not to see miracles, you can blind yourself. If you'd like to remain in a state of stupor, you can see the most miraculous things happening and just say, hey, whatever. It just happenstance. It's just occurrences. But if you want to see God in the world, open your eyes and ask yourself one simple question. What are the odds? What does my mind tell me? When I study a nation still existing after thousands of years, when I see the miracles involved, what do I see? And from an objective, clear standpoint, there's one answer. I see God. God protecting his people. God ushering his people in. And if you'd like to see the message of Chanukah, it's God, you fought our battles then as now. You judged our judgments then as now. You took our revenge then as now. And God is the Jewish people's defender. We are one nation, an exalted nation, an eternal nation, protected by our God. And if you want to think about something when you light the Chanukah candles, it's thinking about history, thinking about the unique journey of the Jewish people and what our role ultimately is supposed to be amongst all the nations.